The Iran war is still raging on even after the June 17th signing of the MOU by President Donald Trump and the president of Iran, which was signed remotely by Trump at the Palace of Versailles in France and by Masoud Pezeshkian, who was the president of Iran. I can't pronounce his name. And he signed it remotely in Tehran, but the war is still going on and much has happened there, which we're going to cover. Also, the Russia-Ukraine war is raging forward, causing many issues, including the fact that Ukraine has recently sent a missile that struck inside of Moscow, hitting a data center, which is huge, going to show the new capabilities of Ukraine that they didn't formerly have at the beginning of this war. We're also going to cover things such as the SAVE Act, what that is, why it's holding up the House of Representatives and all of Congress. No bills are getting passed, and Trump is mad at Republicans right now. What's going on with that? We're going to cover all that, as well as the recent Supreme Court decisions, including Trump versus Barbara, which essentially now says that if you come in the United States and you're an enemy of the states or an illegal immigrant, you can dump a baby and then walk away, and that child will forever be a citizen of the United States, as well as many other things, including the hate for the United States that's coming from the left. We're going to cover all of that today on this show. So thank you so much and buckle up. All right. So for the first thing, the Iran war is still raging on, and people seem to think that it's come to a conclusion. A lot of people don't know what an MOU is, but we're going to go through all of that, and we're going to start with what has actually been signed and what an MOU actually is. So an MOU is not a treaty, and it's not a ceasefire. Now, it can include that, but it is not directly either of those things. So a ceasefire would be an exclusive military agreement, which is not what the MOU is. And that would be if, two states or two countries, let's say in this case, the United States and Iran, if they were to come to a conclusion and the United States were to say, we're not going to release our sanctions, we're not going to fund you, we're not going to trade with you or allow any of our allies to trade with you, but we will stop attacking your military infrastructure. And Iran were to say, we will do the same, that would be a ceasefire. You don't need Congress for that, because according to the Constitution, the president is the chief and commander of the United States Armed Forces, so he can do it on his own without congressional approval. But that's not what this is. It's not a ceasefire. It's also not a treaty. A treaty, you do need congressional approval, and that is a legally binding document. That's why Congress has to be a part of it, that officially sets the terms for what's going to happen going forward. And so those two things are very different. And so this is not legally binding at all. So this is just different than what you would traditionally see. But it is something that the president is allowed to do on his own. So an MOU is essentially a political agreement between two states' leaders or executives that just essentially sort of give a game plan or an agreement to a broad agenda of what we want to do. And part of what the purpose of that is to see if your partner in the MOU is of good faith, right? So if we make an MOU with a country and then they violate all their agreements to it very quickly, which by the way, we're about to get into, Iran has done much of that, you quickly will realize this is not a good faith partner and we don't want to sign a treaty with them. We probably must continue this conflict. So it's kind of a good testing of waters, you could say. And that's really the purpose of what's gone on here. So we're going to go through some of what this MOU actually says, what's happened since then, and what we kind of expect to see. So like I said earlier, President Trump signed this copy of the MOU at the Palace of Versailles in France, which is not necessarily a great look considering that the Palace of Versailles is somewhere that other treaties have been signed that have not been successful, including the one after World War I, which many people attribute to the fact that European states were not properly helped or funded afterwards. And that, again, this is not my own personal opinion, but some reference that as a means to why World War II even started. So not necessarily a great look, especially being in France with Emmanuel Macron, who is someone who definitely does not hold conservative values. But nonetheless, that doesn't really matter. It's just an interesting place to do it nonetheless. And then President Masoud Pezeshkian signed his copy in Tehran. He's been the president of Iran since the 28th of 2024, and he is not the supreme leader or the leader of the IRGC. And that's a big deal. People need to understand that because he is not the supreme leader or the leader of the IRGC, his power is limited. So he can sign this MOU, but because he's not in charge of the IRGC can still go do other things, commit military attacks, and then claim that they didn't sign the MOU, which is some of what we're seeing later on. And so he signed it, which is connected to the IRGC. So he's claiming that this is going to govern part of the IRGC, But we know that that is not exactly how their government's set up, so we can't fully trust that they're going to hold to that. But he does deal with most day-to-day governance. So he's sort of like the actual official administrator of the Iranian government, even though he's not a supreme leader or in charge of their military. So we're going to go through some of the main points that the MOU laid out and what's happened since then. So the first one is a military ceasefire. That is part of this. And I'm going to read directly from Article 1. Here's an exact quote of what it says. It says, the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran and their allies in the current war, by signing this MOU, declare the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon. And that's a big deal. We're going to get to that in just a second. And undertake from now on not to initiate any war or any military operation against each other, and to refrain from the threat or use of force against one another. And then the second point, which is a quote from Article 4, says, immediately upon the signing of this MOU, the United States of America will begin the removal of its naval blockade and any disturbances or impediments against this Islamic Republic of Iran, and will fully end the naval blockade within 30 days. The United States of America further undertakes to remove its forces from the proximity of the Islamic Republic of Iran within 30 days after the final deal. And then the third point is regarding the Strait of Hormuz reopening. This is within Article 5. Here's a direct quote. Upon the signing of this MOU, the Islamic Republic of Iran will make arrangements using its best efforts for the safe passage of commerce vessels with no charge for 60 days only from the Persian Gulf to the Sea of Oman and vice versa. This is huge, and we're about to get into it because Iran has already violated this part by shooting at a Singapore ship that went against the exact shipping lane that Iran wanted for ships to go through. But according to what I just read, it says literally, upon this signing of the MOU, the Islamic Republic of Iran will make arrangements using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial with no charge for 60 days. And also in in Article 4, it also says that there will be no disturbances or impediments. So they clearly did disturb and impede, which is a violation of this MOU. But we're going to finish getting through some of this. And here's some of the more controversial parts is in Article 6, where it says the United States of America undertakes with regional partners to develop a definite, mutual agreed plan with at least $300 billion for the reconstruction and economic development of the Islamic Republic of Iran. That is huge. Now, that's clearly not detailed. It's not worked out, but that is sort of a vague statement saying that we intend to work toward giving $300 billion in reconstruction efforts to Iran over what we did. Now, understand, when Obama signed the JCPOA, we literally sent $3 billion in cash on pallets to Iran to pay them to allow the IAEA to come and inspect whether or not they were building nuclear weapons. And they used that money to actually build more nuclear weapons because they're not a good faith partner. And we've known this. That's the history of our deals with Iran. And so when we see this kind of language of a potential $300 billion in reconstruction developments, that's concerning. Now, listen, I don't think Trump's stupid, and I don't think that that's actually going to happen. By the way, that's not law. That's not being proposed to Congress. The House of Representatives has the power of the purse, so they would have to be the ones to actually authorize that. They would never authorize that, and we know that for a fact. So that's not going to happen. But the fact that it's in the language is a clear, somewhat concession of negotiation that we've made with Iran, which is just interesting considering the fact that we are clearly the dominant country in this conflict, and that we would write something of that nature is very interesting. We're going to get more into that. In Article 7, it says, the United States of America undertakes to terminate all types of sanctions against the Islamic Republic of Iran, including the United Nations Security Council resolutions, IAEA Board of Governors resolutions, and all unilateral U.S. sanctions, primary and secondary, and an agreed upon schedule as part of the final deal. That's interesting because by lowering those sanctions, you're allowing tons of money to flow back into the IRGC. And then in Article 10, it says the United States of America undertakes that immediately upon the signing of this MOU, until the termination of sanctions, the U.S. Department of Treasury will issue waivers for the export of Iranian crude oil, petroleum products, and derivatives, and all associated services, including banking transactions, insurances. That is also huge. And then this will be the last piece that we cover, which is the nuclear program status quo, which is why we got into this war in the first place. We got into this war because we were trying to end Iran's capability of building a nuclear weapon, because if they built one, they would then be given mutually assured destruction, such as North Korea. So if they said to us, hey, or if they said to Israel, hey, Israel, you can't defend yourself against Hamas or Hezbollah or Fatah, we will drop a nuclear bomb on Jerusalem, right? We couldn't do anything about that. So the whole point was, we don't want our most radical enemy in the Middle East to gain the ability to blow up our number one ally in the Middle East, or even threaten to bomb the United States. That was the biggest reason. And now here, this is what we say in the MOU. The Islamic Republic of Iran will maintain the current status quo of its nuclear program, and the United States of America will not impose any new sanctions and will not deploy additional forces in the region. The Islamic Republic of Iran reaffirms that it shall not procure, develop nuclear weapons, etc., etc. So, this is what they're saying. Now, what's the reality of this? Not much of this is really what's happening. That's what's said in there. It is important that we note it and that we read it and that we understand it, but that's not exactly what is happening since then, especially when it comes to the regards of what's going on with their nuclear program. They're not currently capable of working toward building a nuclear program, and they've also agreed under the MOU and other sections to do what's called an on-site downblending. So just to make a clear comparison of the difference between the JCPOA and the Islamabad MOU, which is what we just went over, is that in the JCPOA, that was the 2015 deal that required Iran to remove or export its excessive enriched uranium. So that means if they were using uranium for energy or whatever, right, but they had more uranium than necessary to build green energy or whatever they're claiming to do, that energy had to be exported out of the country if the IAEA said, hey, you've got too much uranium. You can't keep it because we know you're going to build a nuclear weapon. So they had to export it. That's what the JCPOA did. Now, did they always do that? No, and we had a lot of problems. But that's what it did, and this was to ensure it could not be quickly turned into a weapon, right? Now, under the new MOU, the MOU relies on a vague mechanism called on-site downblending. So, and it's under the IAEA supervision. So it's still under their supervision. Now, Iran has since said that they're not going to let IAEA inspectors come on site. And for those wondering what the IAEA is an international organization that goes around and checks different countries' nuclear capabilities, how much enrichment they have, and also how many nuclear weapons they have. And so they're an international organization that's well trusted, even by the United States, and they even check our nuclear enrichment, our nuclear weapons and such. So, but Iran has since said they're not even going to let these folks come into their country. Now, as of now, we don't know if that's true or not. They might let them in. We don't know. But they're saying they're not going to. But in the MOU, it claims that the IAEA would come in and make sure that they're doing on-site downblending. So they don't have to export it. They have to downblend it. And that's a bit sketchy because the details of this are quite lacking, to say the least. And the critics are just arguing that this is a major security loophole. Instead of shipping the materials out of Iran, the regime keeps its enriched stockpiles on site and simply promises to dilute them, which leaves the infrastructure and the potential to rapidly re-enrich the material once they dilute it, right? And the MOU is notoriously thin on inspection details. It mentions IAEA supervision for the downblending process, but it does not reestablish the comprehensive intrusive monitoring regime of the JCPOA. And one conservative actually had said it's a deal based on promises, not proof. Now, one thing I want to say, and I think this is really important, is we must understand that this MOU is not a final deal. This MOU does not really mean anything. Again, this is more from a realistic standpoint about trying to get the Strait of Hormuz open so that we can have lower gas prices and that the Iran war becomes something of the past. Again, the president's administration has, since the beginning of this war, as well as up to this point, and even during their campaign, said that they don't want endless wars. Now, the problem is when you get in a war with Iran, you know, this regime would rather die than secede or give up, right? And so it might quite frankly take a long war for true ultimate success. So what that means is that in order to end this war earlier than killing all of their leaders, you're going to have to concede certain things that you wouldn't necessarily want to, and you might have to take more of a pragmatic approach. Now, the other alternative is to continue the war, to do something such as blowing up Kharg Island. Kharg Island is responsible for exporting around 70% of Iran's oil, which goes to fund the IRGC. So if you blow it up, you blow up immediately 70% of the IRGC's funding. And that's horrible for them, right? But that was one option, but that would also spike oil prices. That would keep the Strait of Hormuz closed longer. That would cause a lot of issues. And so what this MOU is aiming to do is to try and really just get the strait open. And all these other things, such as the $300 billion and such as the downblending and all of that, none of this is in a final deal. So yes, this looks like a crappy MOU. This looks really bad. This looks like, look, hold on. Let me just say one thing here. You know, we want to say like that it's okay, it's whatever. The JCPOA was terrible. We can all agree that JCPOA was bad. It led to tons of illegal enrichment by Iran to make nuclear weapons. But part of why we understand it's bad is also because, you know, Obama was the one who did it, and he didn't really care to do long-term war with Iran. If I were to have read this whole MOU off, you know, because some people are saying, oh, well, it's good because Trump did it. If I were to read this whole MOU off, but I said this was an MOU that Kamala Harris proposed to Iran, almost every conservative would go, this is the stupidest deal we've ever made. Now, that's true. It's still stupid. Just because Trump and Vance did it doesn't mean it's good. Now, I'm a huge Trump supporter, and I'm a supporter of Vance as well. And this is not an attack on them or their agenda. But what I think we have to understand is that unlike the Democrats, the final deal with Iran under Obama was the JCPOA. That was the final deal. There was no deal after that. We ended on a crappy deal. What the Trump administration, I believe, is doing here is they are proposing this MOU, which is not great, but in hopes of getting the strait open, getting through the midterm elections, and then finishing what they need to finish. And Trump has since said that if they continue to attack ships in the strait, that there will be more problems for them to come. And I do trust that, because since they attacked the Singapore ship, we did the very next day begin attacking their military infrastructure once again. And then we paused and went back to our ceasefire. So that's essentially what's happened. Now, one last thing before we move on, I want to cover the part that talks about Lebanon. And in Article 1, it specifically says operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon, and undertake from now on not to initiate any war on any military operation against each other, and to refrain from the threat or use of force against one another. So just to give a little bit of history and understanding here, what this part is talking about is the United States specifically, right? So it's not directly looping in Israel, but it's saying that the United States will not attack Iran, and it literally says including Lebanon, right? That's what it says in Article 1. Now, why is that significant? That's significant because Israel is in a very difficult geographical place. So they are placed west of the West Bank, which is under the control of Fatah. They are north of what's today considered Gaza, or as the left calls it, Palestine, right? Which is really just traditional Judea, Samaria. But nonetheless, so that's where they're positioned. And then to the north of them is Lebanon. Now, Lebanon used to be a Christian nation. They were invaded by Muslims. And now South Lebanon is controlled by Hezbollah, which is an Iranian-funded military group or proxy group that is an extremist Islamic organization that literally has military infrastructure. It's essentially, we can easily compare this to the cartels in Mexico, right? The people of Mexico don't like those cartels. They're also terrorized by them. They're very bad. They've ruined a lot of things. Now they have a lot of influence over the government. That's similarly what's happened in Lebanon. Now, the Lebanese government hates Hezbollah, wants to fight against Hezbollah, doesn't want Hezbollah. Most Lebanese people hate Hezbollah. And so it's a huge problem, but Hezbollah keeps shooting missiles into Israel and into Jerusalem. And so Israel does not start this, right? Israel's doing its thing, and Hezbollah just starts shooting missiles in because, again, this is an extremist group who believes that Jerusalem is promised to them by Muhammad and that this is their holy city and they should be able to take it over and all this kind of stuff, right? And so they're shooting these missiles in. Well, what Israel's done in retaliation is they've shot missiles into South Lebanon. Now, Iran and the left in the U.S. has claimed that this is bad because essentially, you know, Israel is attacking a free and independent state, but that's not true because Lebanon is on Israel's side. Lebanon literally supports the operations of Israel because they also hate Hezbollah. This is not an attack on Lebanon. This is an attack on the Iranian proxy. So what happened was, after this MOU was signed, Hezbollah shot more missiles into Israel, and Israel, as any independent state would do, defended itself by shooting back into Lebanon and striking Hezbollah. Now, because of this, Iran claimed that the deal had been broken, and that's when Trump got upset with Benjamin Netanyahu and told him to stop his attacks on Lebanon temporarily. And they came to a recent ceasefire agreement with Lebanon. Israel did, that was orchestrated through Marco Rubio this last week, which is wonderful for the temporary period of time. But the problem is, it gives Hezbollah time to essentially rebuild. And in the meantime, while Israel takes its forces out of South Lebanon, which they had begun to occupy, Hezbollah is now being given time to rebuild their tunnels, restock their missiles, especially at a time where we're now reducing sanctions on Iran and flooding more money into their system. So this is a big deal. And because of that, that's what led to Iran also wanting to shoot this Singapore ship. And so Iran actually shot a Singapore ship for not using its pass-through strait, which would touch next to the coast of Iran rather than the coast of Oman. And if you don't know what that looks like, you should go look up a map of the Strait of Hormuz. And there's two sides of the strait. One is by Iran, the other is by Oman. The ship went on the south side by the coast of Oman, so Iran shot at the ship for not going through its path. But that doesn't follow the MOU, which they were claiming had already been violated because Israel had attacked Lebanon, which goes against Article 1. The problem is, Israel didn't sign the MOU. The US did. And so, I mean, look, that's like, that would be like if I had a mortgage and I didn't pay my mortgage, and then, the bank came after my neighbor, and my neighbor said, well, I never signed his mortgage. I didn't co-sign his mortgage. Just because he missed his payments doesn't mean you can take my house. That's essentially what Iran did. They said, well, because Israel and the United States worked together on attacking Iran, therefore Israel is implied in this MOU. Well, they're not. They didn't sign it, so they're not implied. But regardless, Marco Rubio was able to successfully get a ceasefire signed by Lebanon and Israel, which has now brought us back to the original state of the MOU. So it's still volatile, but this is essentially where we are at. And so after this, technically, ships are still allowed to go through the Strait of Hormuz, but you may be going, are they actually? No, they're not. And that's because after this attack, the insurance for these ships has skyrocketed. So nobody wants to go through the strait because they don't really know whether Iran is going to shoot them or not. So you may be asking this question finally. Was this MOU worth it? Depends on how you interpret it. Yes, we are moving forward. But as of now, the strait still isn't open, which was truly the whole purpose. I mean, the strait is technically open, but practically it's not. So as of now, I would assume that the Trump administration, as well as Marco Rubio, are working hard to try and find what concessions need to be made in order to get the strait open. So as of now, that is essentially the update of what's going on with Iran. Again, just to kind of go over what's going on, essentially there's a ceasefire, an end of blockade and troop withdrawal. There's a Strait of Hormuz reopening, massive financial concessions, nuclear program status quo. That is the main agenda here. And just to cover the agreement between Lebanon and Israel, here's mainly what's in it. We're not going to go over it heavily just for time's sake, but this is basically what's in it. Is there's an enforcement of full disarmament. So this disarmament, which requires the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah on its own across the entirety of Lebanon, not just along the border of Israel. It also conditions Israel's withdrawal. So it makes any withdrawal of Israeli troops from southern Lebanon strictly performance-based. So Israel's only going to pull out if Hezbollah successfully clears out as well. So Hezbollah has to start going away before Israel goes away, which means if Hezbollah doesn't go away, according to this trilateral framework agreement, Israel doesn't have to go away either. And then it also creates a pilot zones, which is indicating a phase test where Israel withdraws from two specific areas so Lebanese armed forces can move in and take exclusive control and dismantle military infrastructure. So that could be a good thing, but we'll see if it actually works. It also establishes U.S. oversight. It places the United States in charge of a trilateral military coordination group to oversee, verify, and coordinate the disarmament process on the ground. So this is good. This is where we are able to actually go look into, okay, are they actually doing what they're saying they're doing? And can we affirm to Israel that that's actually what's going on? It also sidelines Iran. It explicitly cuts Iran out of the Lebanon security architecture, aiming to permanently sever Tehran's primary proxy, which is Hezbollah, on Israel's northern border, which is something Iran is not going to be okay with and is most likely part of what's stalling the success of the MOU. All right, so moving forward, the Russia-Ukraine war. This is a conflict that many have almost forgotten exists because of how many other headlines are going on. And frankly, it hasn't moved forward much. Now, as you remember, potentially, when Trump was running for office, he said that when the Ukraine-Russia war had started, he had been president, it wouldn't have ever started. And that is probably true, because he most likely would have worked to try and interfere and cause Russia to believe that they would be more harmed by the United States by invading Ukraine than they would benefit by taking land. But at the time under Joe Biden, there was no clear offensive posture that the United States had created for Ukraine. And because of that, this war started. And afterwards, it took a long time for the U.S. to actually start doing things, and no military intervention was made. Now, whether you agree with that or you disagree with that is relevant. What is relevant is the fact that this war, almost 5 years later, is still going on, which is quite crazy. And under the Trump's term, we haven't seen a whole lot of changes. So the front line's largely just stalemated. Russia still occupies roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory, but its ground offenses has slowed almost to a crawl. Ukraine struck a satellite center, as I mentioned earlier, in Moscow, at least in the region, being used to gather intelligence for Russian forces, which was more than 1,300 kilometers away, or 800 miles from the front line, which is the second time that this has happened. And so that just goes to show that Ukraine, from the beginning of the war to now, has changed vastly. At the beginning of the war, they were hardly able to even keep up with the front lines. Now they're actually making offensive attacks into the interior of Russia, which is something Vladimir Putin, we know, didn't want to happen. He wanted to kind of isolate the civilian population of Russia from the effects of this war. He didn't want them to feel the effects. He only wanted Ukraine to feel the effects, because when your country's actually getting bombed, you all of a sudden really don't want to be in war, right? In America, we're doing this whole war with Iran right now, and the worst we're seeing is $5 a gallon gas. That's the worst we're seeing. But if bombs were falling on buildings in our cities, we would have a totally different attitude about it. And Putin knows this of his own people. They don't want missiles flying in to data centers in Russia. So it's intentional that Zelensky is doing this. And the stalemate on the ground, as I said, Russia holds still 20% of Ukraine, but its offensive is slowed significantly to a crawl in Donbass. Ukraine has pivoted to a deep strike drone campaign, as we saw just the other day. It's even hit Russian oil refineries, ports, rail lines, and over 1,100 miles inside Russia into an area that I can't pronounce very well called Yekaterinburg. Putin publicly admitted Russia now has a fuel deficit, which shows to how effective this attack on the interior of Russia has in fact become. But the civilian toll is rising. It's not falling, which you would think would have happened considering that drone warfare is becoming more prominent, but yet it hasn't. The UN reported 274 civilians killed in Ukraine in May alone. So that was just about, today's the 1st of July, so that was basically 2 months ago. 274 people died alone, which is the highest monthly total since April of 2022. So fatality is not necessarily going down. Russia keeps hammering cities with missiles and drones, even as peace talks continue. And then Trump's team, Witkoff, Kushner, Rubio, pushed for a deal by beginning of summer, which we had heard about. That's come and gone. We now have other conflicts. We have the Iran conflict. We have Supreme Court cases. We have major elections coming up. So this has come and gone, and for whatever reason, we have not really stuck to it. The core sticking points are still unchanged, but Ukraine won't concede unoccupied Donbass territory, and Russia won't drop the demand or the NATO membership ban, which is what they want. Congress has broken with Trump actually on this issue. In a rare bipartisan rebuke, the House passed the Ukraine Support Act and a 226 to 195 decision. The new Russia sanctions bring a 500% tariff on Russian goods and $8 billion in arms sales over the objections that Trump and the GOP leadership have failed. But it's still unclear whether the Senate's ever going to pass this. And even if they did, Congress would need a 2/3 majority for this to become an actual thing, because Trump can just veto it if he doesn't agree to it. So Congress is kind of broken with Trump on this, but that doesn't really matter. It's not really going to affect anything. It's not going to affect, the negotiations. And the reason Trump doesn't want them to do this is because he's really not, picking a side. What he wants is the war to end. And to a degree, you can make the argument that that's reasonable. People say, oh, Ukraine is a democratic country. No, it's not. They haven't had an election in nearly 4 years because President Zelensky has declared martial law, which is the equivalent of monarchy, claiming that he's essentially the king of Ukraine because they're in time of conflict. So what? Why can't you still hold an election? Guess what? In Russia, they also don't hold elections. In Ukraine, they have also persecuted Christians. They've gone after churches. They've gone after priests who have spoken out against the Ukrainian government. And so you can easily make the argument that really from a moral standpoint, I don't know if there's really a better country here. There's tons of corruption. One of the most corrupt nations in the whole world has been Ukraine for the last 20 years. They were the whole ones doing the deals with Biden. If you ever read the book, The Laptop to Hell, which you should read if you haven't, describes in detail the accounts of the corruption Ukraine was doing in the United States and the deals they were making. That was the whole reason Trump got impeached the first time, was because he was trying to investigate what had gone on between Biden and Ukraine under Zelensky. And so there's been so much corruption in Ukraine. I don't really know if you can make an argument that Ukraine is necessarily a better government. The only argument you can really make is that Russia is our enemy and we don't want them to take more of Europe. That's a fair argument. But to make the argument that Ukraine is somehow a virtuous... Now, what is coming next? So on July 7th through 8th in a place called Ankara, Trump's attending. Zelensky's been invited. And this is a meeting, this is a NATO summit that's coming up. And despite earlier talks of sidelining Ukraine, Zelensky's been invited, and European leaders such as UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Poland are pre-committing to more sanctions, pressure, and support for Ukraine's energy grid. So they're going to continue to work toward helping Ukraine more and hurting Russia more. And so, many analysts are currently describing Russia's negotiation posture as even being performative. That's more of an opinion you can believe or not believe. I believe that that's mostly true. I do think that Russia is being pretty performative and trying to stall and buy as much time as they can to continue to attack Ukraine. But at the end of the day, I think the conservative posture here is to argue that we shouldn't be sending billions of dollars to foreign countries that don't advance our needs. If Europe wants to protect Ukraine, they can spend all the money they want on that. Now, Russia is our enemy, and we should help Ukraine to the degree of using them to belittle and decrease the strength of the Russian military. But in regards to just openly siding with Ukraine, I don't believe that that aligns exactly with the conservative values, or sending unlimited portions of money as we were under Biden to Ukraine to be a conservative agenda movement, especially when we have way bigger fish to fry in the United States. So that's essentially the current update with what's going on in Ukraine. Now, the SAVE Act has become a huge deal, and I want to first describe what the SAVE Act is. So if you haven't heard of this, this is voter legislation that would be a national requirement for voter security and voter integrity. This is a national voter integrity law. According to Brennan Center for Justice, quote, the legislation requires voters to provide documentary proof of U.S. citizenship, such as a passport or certified birth certificate, to register for federal elections, which would effectively eliminate most online and mail-in registration. The Guardian also reports, quote, a band of conservative hardliners on Tuesday blocked a procedural rule that would have teed up debate and final votes on a slate of legislation, dealing a blow to Speaker. All right, we're going to rewind back to the end of that last quote. So what that quote from the Brennan Center for Justice is just a description of the SAVE Act. And let's be honest and talk about this for a second. There is no need to oppose this. Why would you oppose requiring ID to vote? You need ID for anything. And many of you are thinking, okay, sure, like whatever, why are we talking about this? The reason we're talking about this is because this bill was passed by the House of Representatives, sent to the Senate, and all Democrats and 2 Republicans, or actually, excuse me, 3 Republicans voted against this. Seriously, they voted against requiring ID to vote. Now, you may be wondering why. Yeah, that's a great question. Number one, because we have a lot of Republicans in name only in the Senate and in Congress, and because the Democratic Party recognizes that they could easily lose many votes that they shouldn't have received in the first place that could potentially have been illegal votes. Now, their argument, you may be wondering, what's their argument? Their argument for why we shouldn't adopt the SAVE Act is because that it's racist and that it unproportionately targets African Americans because they claim that African Americans have a harder time obtaining ID than whites. And essentially their claim is that black people are too dumb to get an ID. Think of how racist that is. I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. I don't believe black people are too dumb. I think black people are just as smart as white people, and anybody can go get an ID. And by the way, this law would not require you have a driver's license. It doesn't say you got to be able to drive a car. It just says you need some form of government-issued ID. You can get a government-issued ID aside from a driver's license, by the way. You don't need just a driver's license. That's not the only kind of ID out there. And so it required that, including a passport. You can get a passport, just show your passport. Okay, you can vote. That's it. It's not that difficult. If you want to get SNAP, EBT benefits, any kind of welfare, you need ID. If you want to get a job, you need ID. If you want to do anything, you need ID. Why shouldn't we require that to vote? This is ridiculous that they won't pass it. Well, there was a recent legislation package called an NDAA, which is essentially just a defense for the Department of Defense, a funding package that was brought to the House. And according to The Guardian, it says a band of conservative hardliners, which is, okay, you can call them hardliners, but I'm very proud of them. A band of conservative hardliners on Tuesday blocked a procedural rule that would have teed up debate and final votes on a slate of legislation dealing a blow to Speaker Mike Johnson, as he aimed to advance the annual defense authorization bill this week, end quote. The representatives who voted to block all legislation, not just as NDAA, were GOP reps Tim Burchett from Tennessee, Eric Burlison, Billy Crane from Arizona, Randy Fine from Florida, Andy Harris, Anna Paulina Luna from Florida, Max Miller from Ohio, Chip Roy from Texas, Keith Self from Texas, Victoria Spartz from Indiana, Mike Turner from Ohio, and Thomas Massey from Kentucky, as well as Lauren Boebert from Colorado. So these are our patriots for today who have stood up and said, okay, we cannot move forward with general legislation if we don't deal with the big elephant in the room, which is we need to require voter ID. And they're correct. The rule on Tuesday, which was brought forth, included language that would have merged the Save America Act with the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, which I just talked about, which is a defense funding package, once it passed the House, sending both measures to the Senate and one package through a special procedure called MIR, which is Merving. That's what it's called. Johnson apparently said, quote, "It makes no sense for us to stop our very important progress forward from House Republicans because some Senate Democrats are refusing to do their job." And he's referencing the Democrats who voted against the Save America Act. So his argument is we shouldn't stop regular legislation, including simply because of the fact that Democrats won't pass the SAVE Act. And he goes on to say, that's where we are. That's the reality of it. But Representative Anna Paulina Luna said in a post later, quote, "The current plan being proposed by House GOP to merge NDAA plus Save America is a procedural head fake. This does not do anything but guarantee the Senate will easily take it out. Save America from NDAA," end quote. Luna also posted later on saying, quote, "House GOP leadership should allow an amendment to attach voter ID plus proof of citizenship or Save America Act to actual text of NDAA. If it is not done this way, it will easily be taken out." And she is totally correct. To think that the rhinos and the Democrats are not going to oppose this is crazy. And later on, Roy said, quote, "We need to be on the offensive," and we're not. We ought to be codifying what the president's doing. He's totally right. The fact that Trump signed many executive orders that have been great, including defining men as being men and women as being women and men not being allowed to be in women's sports, that's all great. The problem is when the next Democrat president comes along and erases all that. And so Roy is totally right in saying we need to be on the offensive. We ought to be codifying this. And Luna is correct in saying that we should hold up all legislation until this gets passed, because that's the whole reason that they are actually in Congress. The reason they're in Congress is not to just do business. It's not to just make sure things keep running. It is to make sure that they are advancing the conservative agenda and that they are making sure that our elections are safe. If our elections are safe, who gives a flying hoot if you pass a funding bill? I don't give a crap. I don't know. Anybody can do that. I mean, a 5-year-old could do that. What's unique about electing conservatives to office is that we expect them to actually pass good legislation that benefits all Americans. And that's what this legislation does. That's why it's important that they uphold Congress for now, from doing any other kind of business, and they hold their feet to the fire. Because anytime a good bill, a good conservative bill comes into Congress, about 90% of the time, Republicans pee their pants and they go nuts. And they go, oh, we can't do this because Democrats might not like us. Well, guess what? They're already calling the right Nazis and all this kind. They already hate our guts. We need to do things that are actually good for America and protect all American citizens so that we don't end up living in a country where any old buddy can just walk in and vote, and where you can have tons of ballot harvesting in states like California and not verify if any of those ballots are legitimate or not. And this bill goes to serve to show that we shouldn't allow that. That's huge. And I totally support this, and every conservative should. We should be praising those representatives who just decided to stand for what's true and for what's right, even though they're going to get in a lot of trouble by the mainstream Republican Party for doing this, because this is true conservatism. Now, moving on, we're going to cover some of the bills in Congress. Obviously, the SAVE Act is a huge one, as we just talked about. The NDAA, which is a $1.5 trillion defense authorization. Trump wants specifically $350 billion more after this through reconciliation. But it's moving through the House. If we see this get resolved, which it will soon enough, and as well as the ACA Obamacare subsidies is also in the House currently. It's still unresolved. It's very live. The House passed a 3-year extension in January with a 230 to 196. 17 Republicans in that vote had crossed over after previously not voting to pass it, after the issue had fueled last fall's record-long government shutdown that some of y'all remember. I can't remember exactly how long it was, but it was over 50 days, which is a very long government shutdown. The Senate has rejected, though, similar extensions twice, but a bipartisan working group is still negotiating a comprehensive involving income caps and fraud provisions. Premiums have already spiked for tons of Americans in 2026 while this drags on. But I think it is important that we pause here for just one moment and cover the importance of this. Right? Number one, Republicans should not be voting to continue Obamacare subsidies. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? That is so stupid. That's like if you get shot by a bullet and instead of going to the hospital, have the doctor remove it, you say, you know what? I'm just so busy today. I think I'll just down some more Advil and ibuprofen pills and we'll just numb the pain, even though I have an actual bullet in my leg and I need to go to the hospital. But that's going to take too much time. That's too much work. So I'm just going to, finish work, go home, clean my house, eat dinner, take a shower, go to bed. Maybe in a week I'll go deal with it, right? What's the problem with that? The problem is your wound's going to get infected. You're going to have a lot of problems. You need to go to the hospital, get the bullet removed immediately. Obamacare ruined American healthcare because it went completely against natural economics, and it required employers to give people healthcare coverage, which sounds great in a hypothetical fairy tale world. The problem is that raises the price of healthcare by injecting tons of unnatural funds into that marketplace that weren't there. The price of healthcare is relative to the demand of healthcare, and that's how it previously was. That's why when you talk to your parents and say, oh, back when I was a kid, when I went to the doctor, it wasn't that expensive. That's because the price of healthcare was dependent on how many people needed healthcare, versus today the government has so heavily subsidized healthcare that the equilibrium price has gone way above the demand. So then when a regular person goes into the hospital and needs care, it's thousands and thousands of dollars because the hospital is giving you a rate that they're expecting an insurance company to pay. So if you don't have insurance, you're cooked. And that's why now you need all this government subsidies. So the real problem is government intervention. It is big government. It is the government overspending on these areas, and we actually need to get rid of these subsidies, which is going to be painful at first, but long term would prove to actually reduce the price of healthcare by bringing back equilibrium, which is very important. So Republicans shouldn't be supporting this. This is socialism. Literally, this is socialism, to bring in billions of more dollars toward healthcare funds that will just continue to inflate the price of healthcare. That's not good for anybody. That's very bad. So I don't support this. This is really bad. And as conservatives, I don't think we should be advocating for Obamacare. And if Republicans do vote for this, we should find their names and not vote for them again, because that's bad. So moving on, though, the Ukraine-related bills kind of ties back to what we just covered. The House passed that Ukraine Support Act with the $8 billion in funds. We'll see if that actually happens. It probably won't. It's not veto proof. There hasn't been a floor vote yet. So that's what's going on there. All right, so moving on to some of the Supreme Court decisions that just came out. We had some major ones. The ones we're going to cover are Trump v. Slaughter, as well as the Trump versus Barber case, as well as the Little versus Heckox case. So in regards to Trump v. Slaughter, this was a major case that has been essentially being fought in the court for nearly 100 years, and now it has finally been set on the record straight, and it's a really good case. So the outcome of this result was actually fantastic. Now, some people say it gives the president too much power. That's actually what we're going to read. DEI hire Ketanji Brown Jackson claims that this is going to give the president too much power. Now, if it had been Kamala Harris, the president, trying to get this case through, she would have voted in favor. But because the left is only in favor of interpreting the law the way that benefits them here, she was against it in this situation, even though it was clearly done correctly. But we're going to go through what the case was about and what exactly happened. So this was a United States Supreme Court decision that came out just recently. It was on the constitutionality of statutory removal protections of the Federal Trade Commission. And so this was referencing a previous case that was in 1935 called Humphreys Executor versus United States. And so this was whether a federal court may prevent the removal from public office. And so this had to do directly with whether or not the president has the power to fire someone within the executive branch. And the Humphreys Executor versus United States was a case where FDR, who was a major progressive and had pushed to expand the federal government drastically, had attempted to fire his FTC commissioner. And the reason he wanted to fire him was because the commissioner was a conservative Republican at the time. And FDR had just passed some of the most aggressive antitrust laws that were going to regulate the market significantly. And this conservative Humphreys, he said, I'm not going to go along with this. I'm going to try and keep unregulated the market as much as I can. Well, Roosevelt said that doesn't align with my administration. I'm firing you. Well, in this case, it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said you can't fire Humphreys even though he works under your administration, which is crazy. Now, do I agree with FDR? No, of course I don't. Now, I do believe that the antitrust acts in many cases have helped the economy and helped create things becoming more fair, but also I think that there's a free trade market a free trade argument that can be made as to why those were bad as well. And I can understand Humphrey's point of view and the fact that if people want to engage in certain trade, why should we restrict that? If they want monopolies because they provide better services than a smaller business, then why should we? Now, regardless, that has nothing to do with this case. But what this case was essentially a revision, and it was going over whether or not the president can in fact fire people within the executive, and under the Humphrey Executive versus United States, it ruled that the U.S. Congress may limit the power of the president of the United States to fire certain government officials, even though the president is the chief executive of the U.S. government. The court ruled that the U.S. Constitution allows Congress to restrict the president's authority to dismiss the leaders of independent agencies that are quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial in nature, which is interesting there because the court was defining the FTC as an independent agency outside, or at least that was quasi-legislative, which is just interesting because it's really not, right? Its capabilities and its purpose is to enforce legislation under the executive. It is to execute the law. So of course it falls under the executive branch, and of course it falls under the prerogative of the president to decide whether he wants the commissioner to be in line with his administration. And so, as we talked about, this case stemmed from President Roosevelt's dismissal of Humphrey. But after this case, the court said the only way that you can fire them is if they are either inefficient or neglect their duty, or there's malfeasance in office, which the court now has unanimously held that this limitation on the president's authority to remove FTC commissioners was, which the court then unanimously had held that limitation on the president's authority to remove the FTC commissioners was constitutional, and therefore that Humphrey's dismissals had been unlawful. But the Supreme Court on June 29 issued a 6-3 along the court's ideological lines that the president had the power to remove independent agency heads at will, which obviously overturned this case. The only exception, which we will get to in a little bit more on this, is that he cannot fire members of the Federal Reserve Board or the Federal Reserve Chair, which was determined in a different case that just came out as well, the Trump versus Cook, which was decided the same day. And so what the court essentially said is all of these other executive agencies, they fall under the executive, and there's an argument to be made that the Federal Reserve is an independent bank, but it is part of the executive, right? And so you can make the argument too that because the members on that board are elected to their offices, or they are appointed and then elected by the Senate, right, that because of that, therefore they can't be fired. And that's what the court ultimately decided here, which doesn't fully make sense. I do believe that the Federal Reserve has become extremely political today, but nonetheless, that is what the court said in this case. Justice Roberts stated that, quote, Humphrey's executive is just a dried husk of whatever people used to think it was. It was addressing an agency that had very little, if any, executive power, and that may be why they were able to attract such a broad support on the court at that time. But obviously, the dissenting justices said that the overturning or even the weakening of Humphreys would give the president far more power than even kings or the Parliament of Great Britain at this time of the U.S. founding. Which, I mean, come on, give me a break. Really? If this had been under Biden or Obama or Kamala Harris, they would have been expanding the executive branch as much as they can, and they still want to. Not that they don't want to do this, they just don't want to do it under Trump because they don't want his agenda to continue to expand. So this is purely political that they dissented. There's not a constitutional argument to be made against it. Justice Jackson said, quote, having a president come in and fire all the scientists and the doctors and the economists and the PhDs and replacing them. Justice Jackson, of course, said, quote, having a president come in and fire all the scientists and all the doctors and the economists and the PhDs and replacing them with loyalists and people who don't know anything is actually not in the best interest of the citizens of the United States, according to Reuters. And I mean, yeah, you could make that argument, but that's not consistent. I mean, why didn't you then restrict Biden when he was putting all these people in all these executive offices who were clearly DEI hires? Right? I mean, we had a man who literally shaved his head, put on lipstick, wore dresses, worked in the White House, and was stealing people's luggage at airports on a regular basis. That's why they had to fire him. This guy was a lunatic. We had a transgender. We had a man who thought he was a woman running the Health and Human Secretary office, which now Robert Kennedy is running. So, I mean, yeah, y'all literally fired the scientists and the doctors and the economists to replace them with just DEI hires, which, by the way, Justice Jackson is a DEI hire as well. So to make that argument, it's not necessarily an incorrect argument objectively that we shouldn't just be expanding the executive branch, but it is within his constitutional prerogative. And also, that's not a consistent argument that Democrats use with themselves. So it's ridiculous that she said this, but nonetheless, she said it, of course. Now, moving on to Trump versus Barbara, this was really the big one. This was the one that people are talking about the most, and it's because it's really the most important one, as also many of the justices agreed it was. Now, this was the case on birthright citizenship. Trump, on his first day in office, signed an executive order that ordered the ending of birthright citizenship. Now, of course, we knew this was going to go through the court system, but what it was going to force to happen was a relooking at the 14th Amendment and whether or not it actually provides birthright citizenship, or if it doesn't. And I believe that it very clearly does not. We're going to go through that, but we're also going to go through this case in depth. So, based on the 14th Amendment interpretation of citizenship, the 14th Amendment was created to directly contradict the Dred Scott decision, which ruled that Scott, a slave, would not be granted citizenship due to his slave status in Mississippi. And the Dred Scott decision was probably one of the worst decisions that the Supreme Court has ever made in its history. It was a case where a man who was a slave in Mississippi was taken to Illinois, which at the time was a slave-free territory. And because it was a slave-free territory, Scott assumed he had then been given citizenship. But he was brought back later to Mississippi, and so what happened was the state of Mississippi ruled that he was a slave of Mississippi, and because he was of African descent, that he couldn't be given citizenship, that it was not a right of his. Now, this was about 4 years before the Civil War, and this case ended up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually gave a ruling which said that same thing, it concurred. You cannot have citizenship even though you were born in the United States, you were moved to a slave-free territory. You still cannot be granted citizenship because you are of African descent. So understand this: after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment was created so that it could no longer be disputed whether folks of African descent who had been born in the United States and were of the jurisdiction that they lived in, meaning whatever town or state they lived in, they had permanent domicile in. If that was the case, therefore they should have citizenship, and the court could not make a constitutional argument against that because we put it in the Constitution that that's not how things would work. So that's what happened after the Dred Scott decision, was it pushed for the 14th Amendment. Now, today, the court is interpreting that amendment to mean anyone who comes to the United States, whether they have permanent domicile or not, meaning whether they permanently reside here or not, should just be given citizenship. Anybody who just comes here, has a kid, that kid is given citizenship, and therefore their parent can pretty much just stay here forever, even if their parent is a criminal and has done all sorts of things. As long as you just had a kid on our soil, you can now live here forever. Which, by the way, if you're thinking to yourself, that doesn't make any sense, you're right, that doesn't make any sense, and that's stupid, especially when we have the greatest country in the world, and we're just essentially saying anybody can come here and become a citizen. You know, this is ridiculous. So, but the specific language in this amendment doesn't just, as I said before, it does not just blanketly give out birthright citizenship. The writers of the amendment didn't intend for anyone to show up and just have a baby and that baby become a citizen, even though they have never lived here and they don't intend to maybe permanently live here, or at least in the past they haven't. And that's why the amendment includes a quote that says, under the jurisdiction thereof. This is not just extra fluffy words. This is an actual legal boundary on the birthright clause, as we just previously covered. So the Trump administration was arguing that the language of the 14th Amendment was only meant to apply to the newly emancipated slaves and their children, and not to those from other countries, which is true. That is exactly what it was made for. They cited that, as we covered with the Dred Scott decision. They cited statements of late 19th century writers Alexander Porter Morse, Francis Warden, and George D. Collins, all who proposed narrower interpretations of the 14th Amendment to limit who was eligible for birthright citizenship. The administration also referred to Ellick versus Wilkins, an 1884 Supreme Court case, where the court found that a Native American born on a reservation was not eligible for birthright citizenship, since at the time the reservations were considered sovereign nations, which was different. Which, by the way, the Indians were given citizenship later on, but that was through the Indian Citizenship Act, not through the 14th Amendment. So you can't make the claim that Native Americans were given citizenship through birthright, because they weren't. They were given it through the Indian Citizenship Act, not the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment does not apply to them. Justice Clarence Thomas also wrote a 90-page dissenting opinion, because he didn't vote with the majority on this case to give out citizenship blanketly to anyone born here, which Justice Neil Gorsuch joined. Thomas argued that the United States versus Wong Kim Ark only applied to children of permanent residents. And for those not familiar with that case, that was a case where a man named Wong Kim Ark, who was born in the United States in San Francisco to Chinese parents who were citizens of China but were permanently living in the United States and on active visas, legal visas at the time. They had their child, who was Wong Kim Ark, and he had left the United States and came back after leaving temporarily on a trip. And when he came back, because he was technically a permanent resident of the U.S. but not a citizen, he was denied entry due to the Chinese Exclusionary Act, which was a temporary piece of legislation that banned new Chinese citizens for the next 10 years. And that was because of the time Congress was seeing that Chinese residents were having a harder time assimilating to American culture than other immigrants from Europe. So they said, okay, for the next 10 years, we're not going to allow any more Chinese citizens, because we don't want our culture to become more diluted, and we want to give these folks more time to assimilate. Now, because of that, he wasn't deported, and Chinese residents were not deported. It just meant going forward, we're not allowing new entry. And so when he showed up, he said, hey, I'm actually a U.S. citizen because I was born here. So under the 14th Amendment, I should be given citizenship, which is later on what happened. But the reason he was given citizenship wasn't just because he was born here. It was because he was also, as the 14th Amendment says, under the jurisdiction thereof, meaning his parents were on a permanent visa and he was had permanently resided in the United States and planned to do so going forward. He hadn't just shown up. His parents hadn't just had him that wasn't the case. Because of his parents' status, which is what the court has previously always looked at, that's what allowed him to have citizenship. If his parents had never lived in America and they had just shown up and had him, he wouldn't have been given citizenship. The reason he was given that was because his parents had lived there their whole life. They were under the jurisdiction thereof, as the amendment says. He had lived there his whole life. And so the court said, of course the 14th Amendment applies to you. But that is not the same as what we're seeing today with anchor babies. Totally different situation. And so that's what Thomas argued. He said, in this case, clearly, this only applies to children of permanent residents. He wrote that it had first centered on, quote, equal rights for the freed blacks, but it had been used to grant citizenship to children of undocumented immigrants and temporary visitors, which is what they're doing today. Justice Samuel Alito and Gorsuch also wrote separate dissenting opinions. Alito would have overturned Wong Kim Ark, while Gorsuch would have allowed for the executive order to go into effect for temporary residents, but denied its effect for permanent residents. Meaning, Gorsuch would have essentially said, yeah, okay, clearly the 14th Amendment applies to those who have had children here who were permanent residents as the parents, but if you are a temporary resident and you're expected to go back to your country of origin, then if you had a child here, we're not going to give you your child's citizenship because they're not under the jurisdiction thereof. So Gorsuch agreed in that case. Now, Roberts had a very interesting and very wrong point of view on this whole case. Roberts, by the way, is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was a Bush appointee. He usually seems to lean with the majority opinion because he likes the idea of having a unanimous court decision, even if the majority opinion is wrong. That seems to be his consistent stance. And Roberts, unjustly, I believe, he traced the roots of American birthright citizenship directly to the English common law and under the concept of jus soli, which means the right of the soil. He explained that under this centuries-old tradition, anyone born within the territory of the sovereign automatically acquired citizenship or subjecthood at birth, regardless of their parents' nationality or legal status. And that's true. That was the case in England for a long time. But understand that being a citizen and being a subject of the king are two different things. Being the subject of a king means that you're technically under his legal authority. Being a citizen comes with certain rights and benefits, and those were not the same. So even that, he gets wrong. And the majority argued that the early American courts and legal scholars adopted this British common law framework long before the 14th Amendment was ratified, which is somewhat true. But that's why we ended up with the 14th Amendment, was because there was this common law was not being consistently applied. That's why you had things such as the Dred Scott decision go so poorly. So there's a reason the 14th Amendment exists and why we don't go off British common law anymore. Also, we fought a whole revolution to get away from the British rule of law. And even today, and we won't go down this rabbit trail right here, but even today, you're seeing in England how English common law is completely failing their system now. Because of jus soli was accepted as a legal baseline, Roberts reasoned that the drafters of the Citizenship Clause, all persons born and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, intended to codify this exact understanding into the Constitution, which, again, as I've stated, I would completely disagree with. The dissent, in a sprawling 97-page dissent, Justice Thomas, joined partially by Justice Gorsuch, as I mentioned before, argued that being subject to the jurisdiction thereof is not synonymous with merely having to obey local traffic laws or criminal codes while inside the country. Instead, he argued it required being domiciled in the United States, meaning being a permanent resident. Thomas emphasized that domicile is the legal term for a permanent home. He argued that the Citizenship Clause was intended only for permanent members of the body politic, people who called the United States home and who owed it their sole loyalty, meaning you're not loyal to any other country. You're not going around saying, oh, Mexico first, or China first, or Saudi Arabia first. You live here permanently, you desire to be an American, you are assimilating or already have, and you've now had a child in the United States, but your visa grants you to stay here permanently, then that child would also be under the jurisdiction thereof, therefore granting them birthright citizenship, which goes completely against the common law. But the common law doesn't matter. Why are we bringing common law into a U.S. Supreme Court case when we already have the U.S. Constitution and the 14th Amendment being clear on this? And that's exactly what Thomas and in many cases Gorsuch was arguing as well. But the dissenters argued that true citizenship requires a mutual consent between the sovereign nation and the individual. Because foreign tourists, temporary visa holders, and unauthorized immigrants retain primary allegiance to a foreign nation, they argue that their U.S.-born children cannot be entirely subject to the jurisdiction thereof of the United States at the exact moment of birth, which is true, that they can't, and that's why we shouldn't allow them to be citizens, which is an interesting argument for the majority to be against, but they are against this argument. Thomas argued that the 14th Amendment had a highly specific, race-conscious primary purpose to overrule the infamous Dred Scott decision, which is true. Justice Gorsuch, writing a separate brief dissent, emphasized that the American birthright citizenship intentionally broke away from the English common law rule of jus soli. In the American Republican system, the dissenters argued citizenship was never meant to be an accident of geography. It required permanent resident and consensual allegiance. The dissenters even pointed to the congressional debates surrounding the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the drafting of the 14th Amendment. Thomas cited assurances made by the authors and supporters of the Citizenship Clause, noting they repeatedly promised the text would exclude the children of persons temporarily residing here, because the United States, quote, would have no right to make them citizens. Like, this almost couldn't be more clear, that they were totally misinterpreting the 14th Amendment. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, okay, what are we going to do? Are we cooked? You know, can someone just come here on a tourist visa in the last month of their 9-month pregnancy, hoping to have a child in the United States so that they can use that as a way to get a permanent visa? Not necessarily. The State Department can start denying people temporary visas to come in the United States if they're past 3 months pregnancy, and if that visa is going to allow them to stay anytime past then. Now, if someone comes here, they become pregnant, then we should say, okay, once you get past 3 or 4 months of that pregnancy, you got to go home, because we can't have you here when you have that baby, because then that baby will become a citizen. So there are things the executive can do and the State Department can do already to start putting people out who are about to have a child here, so that we don't start granting citizenship to people who are about to have children or intentionally are having children here so that they can gain a means into the United States. And listen, you may be saying, well, hold on, what's the problem with this? Why wouldn't we want people just coming here and having kids and those kids becoming American citizens? And what a great blessing that is for them. And yes, that's true. But the problem is, immigrants we have today, some of them are very good, but many of them are not. And people assume that the immigrants we have today are the same as the immigrants that we had at the founding of our country. But the problem is, they are two different kinds of immigrants. There's a difference between becoming a settler and becoming an immigrant who is coming simply for benefits or different securities, right? It's one thing if you open a bakery and you put a sign out that says now hiring. You're going to get a very different group of people coming in than if you open a donut shop and put a sign that says free donuts. The people coming in that case, they just want free donuts. They don't want to work. If you put up a sign that says now hiring, you're not going to get people who want to freeload. You're going to get people who actually want to work in the United States and do things. And at the founding time, we did have lots of immigrants who came as settlers, but they weren't coming because the United States had the best welfare and because they could get access to emergency health care and because they could get access to Medicare and because they could get a Social Security number, which could give them all sorts of payment benefits for being below the poverty level. They didn't come for that. They came because the United States offered things such as private property and private possession of your own business. So if you came to the United States, you would be taxed very low regulated, and you'd be able to do your business and own your property without potentially having some political figure who doesn't like you for your views or your religion take your property or your business from you. The United States provided securities that allowed people to prosper, but they had to do it on their own. So you have a totally different kind of immigrant today, and with the way that the Supreme Court just interpreted birthright citizenship, it now continues to put up that sign that just says free donuts. Just come on in, have a kid, and then reap all the benefits without actually supplying any real means to American society. And you see this clearly with the Somali immigration, right? The Somali immigration has actually caused a net deficit. We are losing around $9 billion a year in comparison to what they are being taxed as immigrants. Between their taxes and their welfare, we're losing around $9 billion a year on Somali immigrants, right? These are not settlers. These are people who are coming to just take from our systems. Now, let me be clear. That is not all immigrants. There are still good immigrants today who come to America for the right reasons and they're coming because they do want a better life and they do want to prosper here. So this is not a dogging or a trashing on immigrants or settlers or anything like that, but this is saying that we do need to be selective in who we allow in the United States, because it is the greatest country in the world. And I get it. I don't blame these people. I would want to come to America too if I were them. But at the end of the day, what this court did was it threw the case back in Congress's face. Congress needs to now pass a law defining how citizenship is given and then have the president sign that law. So we need to put a lot of pressure on our Republican representatives and senators that they need to pass a law defining how citizenship is. And if the court strikes that down again, then we need to rewrite this part of the 14th Amendment, pass a constitutional amendment that argues and says clearly for the Constitution that by just having a kid here, that kid will not become a citizen. You must already be a permanent resident for that to happen. All right. Now, moving on to Little v. Hecox. Now, this is a very clear case. This is a very important case, but nonetheless a very clear one. This is over the state of Idaho, which had passed a law banning men from women's sports. Now, that seems pretty straightforward, but again, we live in essentially a Romans 1 situation in the world today where people cannot see truth from falsehood and the light from darkness. And so at this point, it's crazy, but we have to do this. There's literally a case in the Supreme Court that was just decided on whether or not a man can compete in women's sports. And by the way, let's talk about feminism for a second, right? Feminists say that they're standing up for women's rights. Well, not at all clearly. It's such an ingenuine movement because of the fact that the moment that a man, this is patriarchy, I thought, right? The moment a man says, hey, I'm going to go take all your trophies, all your hard work, all your success, and not really do anything, but just waltz on in here and take it all from you. The moment that happens, the feminists get real quiet and they go, oh, well, no, that's a real woman. And you say, well, what's a woman? And they go, oh, that's patriarchal. You can't ask the question, what's a woman? We can't define that for you. Well, what's the point of being a feminist then? What? Like, that's crazy. Well, anyways, that's what this case was over. And so it was defining whether or not states have the right to actually ban men from women's sports, which of course they do, but we actually had 3 Supreme Court justices say that they don't, which were the 3 liberal justices, which is quite scary considering that the next president may be a Democrat and appointing more liberal Supreme Court justices or trying to pack the court, as many socialists, including Zohran Mamdani, want to do. But essentially, the way that they had to win this case was to waltz all around the left's toes and use very sensitive language. So they had to define the difference between gender and sex, which at the end of the day, there is no difference really. You're either a man or a woman, and that is either your gender or your sex. They are interchangeable. They are the same thing. But for legal purposes, they had to define them as different, saying that the state's law was not a violation of Title IX, but instead it actually upheld Title IX by protecting women of women's sex, not women's gender, because they're claiming that gender is interchangeable. As a guy, you can wake up tomorrow and your gender can be a man or be a woman, but your sex doesn't change. And that's what the law is saying. And so this kind of what you could call segregation would therefore be legal. Solicitor General Alan Hurst of the state of Idaho argued that the law's classification is based on birth sex, not transgender status, and is necessary because sex is what matters in sports due to alleged psychological advantages such as bone density and lung capacity, which these are not alleged, these are just scientific facts, that men have better bone density and better lung capacity, and also higher testosterone, which gives them a huge biological advantage on women, and that's why we need a separation. He contended that Title IX was originally written to protect cis females, which, by the way, cis females is just a liberal word that means women. That's all it means. Real women, not men who cut their male parts off and then trot around saying that they're women, which is disgraceful and a huge offense to women's rights, but actual women. So now for Hecox, the attorney Kathleen Harnett argued that the law fails intermediate scrutiny because it is overbroad, excluding transgender women, which is just a man who thinks he's a woman, who have medically mitigated any supposed biological advantages, meaning that they have taken all sorts of medication to get their testosterone down or to have their genitals cut off or all these horrible things that they're doing to kids, that any supposed biological advantages through testosterone suppression. She contended that the law enforces sex stereotypes. What? This is ridiculous. And subjects all female athletes to invasive medical scrutiny. I'm sorry. No, this subjugates all real women to the invasive part of their privacy where they should be allowed to compete against one another and also not have guys going in their own bathrooms. This is ridiculous. So Title IX's first 37 words reads, and I'm going to read this to you in quote so that you understand what it says and how this does not violate it. It says, quote, "No person in the United States shall on the basis of sex be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." So essentially what they were saying is, hey, because this is funded by the government, this is discrimination based on sex. But what the state of Idaho is able to prove is that it's not a discrimination based on sex, which is exactly what Title IX says it has to be based on for it to be a violation of the Civil Rights Act. And they were able to make the point that, okay, you can believe you're whatever gender, but that doesn't change your sex, which is what the title goes over. And Amy Coney Barrett even said she was worried that if they were to uphold what Haycox was fighting for with Kathleen Harnett, that it would actually give a constitutional right to transgender people for men to compete in women's sports. And that, she said, was too far, right? There is clearly no constitutional right. So in a 6-3 decision, luckily the state of Idaho won, which should be very clear. But sadly, we have 3 justices who think that this is a violation of a constitutional right for transgender people, which of course this is not. So that is what happened with these cases. We've ran out of time. There's more to come. We're going to talk next time more about the elections in New York City, the Democratic Socialists in New York. You may be wondering, why does that matter? It matters because they are literally eating the face of the Democratic Party. You're having people such as the chairman of the Democratic Party come out and say, hey, we need to stop letting these socialists on our ballot. Well, I'm sorry. I think it's too late. I think they've already eaten your face, and now they're just going to wear your skin around and claim that they're the Democratic Party until they get in office and actually are socialists. That's happening. It's going to affect the nation. There's a good chance AOC will be the next nominee of the Democratic Party. All of that to come. We are going to cover so much more. Thanks for tuning in and listening to my show. I really appreciate it. And we're going to keep posting and telling you what's going on in the news and giving a conservative angle so that you can understand it and believe it. If you disagree with anything I said, please put it in the comments or send me a message and let me know. I'd love to debate more of this and to go over in my next episode some of the disagreements that people maybe have brought up, or if you think I'm just outright wrong. So thanks so much for tuning in. This is it for today.